Looking back was how women in movies died. Jade Miller's bare feet hit the frozen Chicago pavement, and she ran past the shattered glass still ringing in her ears, past the warmth she'd spent 2 years trying to earn, past the version of herself that had believed love could fix a broken man. It couldn't. She knew that now. She'd learned it from a wine bottle. The wall had stopped it. 3 more inches to the left, and it would have stopped her. Evan's voice had gone quiet after he threw it, that terrible, bottomless quiet that meant he'd crossed somewhere new inside himself. Jade had seen fury before. She'd seen cruelty dressed up as passion and jealousy dressed up as devotion, but the look in his eyes in that kitchen, in that silence, wasn't rage anymore. It was math. She'd grabbed nothing. No coat, no phone, no shoes. Instinct didn't wait for preparation. The parking garage on Wacker appeared out of the dark like a concrete prayer, and she ducked inside, lungs screaming, feet going numb against the oil-stained floor. She moved between cars, crouching, listening for footsteps that weren't there yet. 3rd level. A sleek black Genesis, windows tinted dark as a secret. Unlocked. She didn't think. She opened the back door, folded herself onto cold leather, and pulled it shut behind her. The smell hit her immediately. Cedar, something expensive, and an order so deliberate it felt like a warning. Jade told herself she'd stay 10 minutes. Just enough time to breathe, to think. She was still lying to herself when the footsteps came, unhurried, certain, the walk of someone who had never needed to rush because the world already arranged itself around him. The driver's door opened. She stopped breathing. He didn't start the car. Didn't speak, just sat, and somehow the silence he brought in with him was nothing like Evan's silence. Where Evans went cold and hungry, this one was contained, surgical, like a room with no exits that still managed to feel completely safe. Then the interior light caught the rearview mirror, and he looked at her. No shock, no threat, just a single question, asked in a voice that could have been discussing the weather. Who did this to you? Jade's jaw was trembling. Her feet were bleeding. She had nothing, no leverage, no explanation, no reason this stranger shouldn't drag her out by her arm and call the police. She should have been terrified. She wasn't. Later, she would understand why. Later, she'd learn that Kang Minjae produced that particular stillness in everyone around him not because he was safe, but because danger, when it belonged entirely to him, felt indistinguishable from protection. She didn't know his name yet. Not then, not until the city started whispering it like a warning. Kang Minjae. She didn't know what he ran, what he owned, or what happened to the people who moved against him. She only knew that she was bleeding in a stranger's back seat, and he was waiting patiently, without judgment, for her answer. So she gave it. And the moment she did, she stopped being invisible. In a world where his enemies didn't argue, didn't negotiate, didn't forgive, they would learn her name. The penthouse didn't feel like a home. It felt like a decision. Jade stepped inside and understood immediately that every detail had been chosen with the same cold precision its owner carried in his eyes. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan like a statement of ownership. The furniture was minimal, expensive, and arranged with the kind of order that didn't invite comfort, it commanded it. Beautiful. Deliberately so. And underneath the beauty, something harder. She noticed the doors first. Reinforced steel beneath the matte finish, hinges too thick to be decorative. Then the cameras, not obvious, not hidden, but placed, like a man who wanted you to know you were being watched without knowing exactly where from. And the guards. 2 of them near the elevator, standing with that particular stillness that didn't come from discipline alone. It came from having used violence before and being entirely willing to use it again. Minjae had said almost nothing during the drive, nothing beyond what was necessary, nothing that demanded she perform her pain for him. He'd handed her a phone to make any call she needed, offered no questions, and kept his eyes on the road with the patience of a man who understood that silence was sometimes more generous than words. She hadn't called anyone. There was no one to call, who wouldn't make things worse. Now he gestured toward a hallway, and a woman appeared 50s, quietly efficient, who guided Jade to a bathroom stocked with everything she hadn't thought to take when she fled. Clothes in her size, medical supplies, the kind of preparation that unsettled her almost as much as Evan's fist ever had. Because preparation like this meant this wasn't the first time. She was cleaning the cut along her collarbone when the knock came. Not Minjae, a man built like a closing argument, with eyes that had already reached a verdict the moment they found her face. "Ronan Kwan," he said, not entering. "Head of security, I need to ask you a few questions about the man who did that." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't unkind. Jade answered everything. His name, where he lived, who his family was. She watched Ronan's expression stay perfectly controlled, except for one moment, a fractional tightening around the jaw, when she mentioned the last name, Castellano. He left without explaining why that mattered. She found out an hour later. Minjae stood at the window with his hands in his pockets when Ronan returned and delivered the information in the low, clipped shorthand of men who'd had many conversations no one else was meant to hear. Jade caught fragments. Marcus Castellano. 3 operations connected to the Volkov syndicate. The son runs personal enforcement. Minjae didn't react with shock. He reacted with recognition. "Evan Castellano isn't just a violent man," Minjae said, finally turning from the glass. His eyes found Jade with an expression she couldn't name. Not pity, not calculation. Something between the two, and heavier than either. He is connected, which means your leaving him hasn't just made you free. He paused. It's made you visible. Jade stared at him. She'd spent 2 years being invisible, and it had nearly killed her. Now this stranger with a fortress for a home was telling her that the alternative was somehow worse. She thought about the wine bottle, the wall, those 3 inches. "What does that mean?" she asked. Minjae studied her the way a man studies something he's already decided to protect, even before he's admitted it to himself. "It means," he said quietly, "that you didn't escape one problem tonight." He turned back to the window. "You walked into a larger one." She found him at 3 in the morning. The penthouse had gone dark and quiet, except for the distant pulse of the city below, and Jade had given up pretending sleep was coming. She'd padded barefoot through the hallway, old habit, soft steps, learned in a home where sound had consequences, and found the balcony door ajar. Minjae stood with both hands on the railing, a cup of tea cooling beside him, watching the lake, the way a man watches something that owes him nothing, but that he returns to anyway. He heard her before she reached the door. She was certain of it, but he didn't turn. "Can't sleep," she said. Not a question, an offering. "I rarely do." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stepped outside. The cold hit cleanly, honest in a way the warmth inside wasn't. She stood beside him and looked out at the water, black and endlessly moving, indifferent to both of them. Neither spoke for a long time. Then he said, "My mother had a bruise," she explained, "for 11 years. Jade went still. Different excuses. Same bruise, different locations. I believed her until I was old enough to understand that belief was just another way of participating." He picked up the tea, looked at it, set it back down. "She died when I was 19. The courts gave my father 4 years. He served 2, but the violence started long before that, so by the time she was gone, I'd already spent years learning what the system pretends not to see." The city hummed below them, oblivious. "I sat outside the courthouse the day he walked out," Minjae continued, "and I made a decision. Not out of grief. Not even out of anger." His voice was even stripped of theater, which somehow made it worse. "I decided I would build something the legal system couldn't. Not better. Not cleaner." A pause. "Just more effective." Jade turned to look at him. His profile was composed, unreadable in the way of men who had done their grieving so long ago it no longer showed on the surface, only in the architecture. of the choices they'd built around the wound. "And you have?" she asked. For 12 years, he finally turned to meet her gaze. "I find the men the courts ignore, the ones protected by money, by connection, by the particular cowardice of institutions designed to process paperwork rather than protect people." He said it simply. No apology, no pride. "And then?" she pressed. "And then they are no longer a problem." She should have been frightened. Logically, she knew that. A stranger in a high fortress, admitting to operating outside every system that was supposed to keep her safe. This was the part where a rational woman excused herself and reconsidered every decision that had led to this balcony. But Jade Miller had spent 2 years in the custody of a man the legal system had failed to stop 3 separate times. She understood what Minjae was telling her. She understood it in her bones. "You're not a good man," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you're not like him." Minjae looked at her for a long moment. In his eyes was something she hadn't seen aimed in her direction in longer than she could remember. Not desire, not possession, not the careful performance of care deployed to establish debt. Just clarity. "No," he said, "I am not like him." Jade turned back to the lake. The cold didn't bother her anymore. For the first time in years, she felt something she'd forgotten had a name. Safe. And because she was only human, and because safety after deprivation hits the bloodstream like a drug, she felt something else, too. Something she had absolutely no business feeling for a man like this. She ignored it. For now, it took 6 days for the past to catch up. Ronan brought the news on a Tuesday evening with the particular expression of a man delivering information that could not be improved by the manner of its delivery. He set a tablet on the kitchen island in front of Minjae. Security footage. A parking garage. Timestamp from the night Jade had climbed into the wrong car. "Leaked," Ronan said. "Someone in the garage's management system sold access. The footage has been moving through the Castellano network for 48 hours. On the screen, Jade watched herself, barefoot, bleeding, folding herself into a stranger's backseat like she could make herself small enough to disappear. She watched Minjae return to the car, watched the doors close, watched the plate number sit perfectly legible in the frame. "He knows," she said. "He's been asking questions since yesterday." Ronan's jaw was set. Through 3 different intermediaries across the city's lower networks. He's not moving yet. He's building a picture. Minjae hadn't touched the tablet. He was looking at a point in the middle distance with the focused stillness of a man running calculations. "He's not the only one paying attention," Ronan added, and his voice shifted a half-degree cooler, which on Ronan functioned as another man's alarm. He swiped to a second screen. A surveillance photograph. A man in his 60s, silver-haired. The kind of face that money and cruelty had refined over decades into something that looked almost aristocratic until you met the eyes. Viktor Koslov. Volkov was noise compared to Koslov local muscle versus international appetite, and Minjae understood the difference the way sailors understand weather. The name landed in the room like a weight. "Arms dealer," Minjae said, not asking, "and trafficking routes through Eastern Europe and the South Pacific. He has unfinished business with Marcus Castellano, a deal that collapsed 2 years ago and cost Koslov significant resources and at least 2 men." Ronan paused. "He's been watching the Castellano network for an opportunity, and now the footage exists. Now there's a woman who fled from Evan Castellano, currently living under Kang Minjae's protection." He let the logic complete itself. Jade's mouth had gone dry. "He wants to use me," she said. "Against Evan's father." "Or against me," Minjae said. The calculation behind his eyes had resolved into something colder and more purposeful. He looked at Ronan. "How long do we have before he moves from observation to action?" "Days. A week at most." Minjae nodded once. Then he looked at Jade with an expression that she was beginning to learn meant he was about to tell her something she wouldn't want to hear, delivered with the same level tone he would use to discuss the weather. "You didn't simply escape a dangerous man," he said. "You told me that already. I know. He held her gaze. I needed you to understand how much larger the danger has become. Jade thought about the version of herself 6 days ago, barefoot, running, believing that distance was the same thing as safety. She almost laughed. She'd traded one orbit of danger for another, wider, darker one, belonging to a man who made the first look almost manageable by comparison. And still, she was not sorry she'd climbed into that car. The gunfire started in the underground garage on a Wednesday evening at 6:47 p.m. Jade heard it from the penthouse as a muffled percussion, distant and unreal, the kind of sound your mind initially refuses to categorize correctly because your nervous system is still insisting that the world is safe. She was in the kitchen when Minjae appeared from his office, already moving, already transformed the quiet, deliberate man from the balcony, replaced by something faster and more elemental. "Stay in the interior hallway," he said, not loud. He didn't need volume to be obeyed. "Away from the windows. Don't open the door for anyone who doesn't use the green channel on the intercom." "What's happening?" "Ronan." That was all he said. Then he was gone. She did what she was told. The interior hallway had no windows, a reinforced door at each end, and a bench built into the wall that suggested this was not a contingency Minjae had designed in a hurry. She sat on it, with her knees pulled to her chest, and listened to the sounds she couldn't interpret and the silence that was somehow worse than the sounds. It lasted 11 minutes. She counted. Not the gunfire, the waiting, the stretch of time where she couldn't tell whether silence meant safety or bodies. When Minjae returned, he was unhurt but different, the way a man is different after violence has moved through him and settled, the way certain rooms are different after a storm. Ronan was behind him, a cut above his eyebrow, sealed with a practiced hand, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man managing pain without acknowledging it. "Koslov's men," Minjae said, before she could ask. "3 of them. They came for Ronan specifically, which means it was a message, not an operation." He said it clinically, the way a surgeon described a complication. "They wanted us to know he can reach us." "And the 3 men?" Jade asked. Minjae looked at her steadily. "They delivered the message," he said, "and then they were no longer necessary." The words settled over her. She understood what they meant. She understood also that she was not horrified in the way she perhaps should have been, and that this understanding said something about what 2 years with Evan Castellano had done to her capacity for moral geometry. "They know about me," she said. "Yes, that I'm here, that She stopped. The full shape of it was assembling itself in her mind with terrible clarity. "That hurting me is a way to hurt you." Minjae sat across from her, elbows on knees, hands loosely clasped, a posture of honesty rather than authority. For a moment he just looked at her, and in his expression was something she hadn't seen there before. Not guilt. He was not the architecture of guilt. But responsibility, carried fully, without deflection. "Yes," he said again, "I will not deceive you about what that means. You are safer here than anywhere else in this city. But staying here means accepting that my enemies now consider you a leverage point." He paused. "Leaving means that protection disappears." Jade stared at him. She thought about Evan, about Koslov's silver-haired photograph and his old man's predator eyes, about the parking garage and the unlocked car and every improbable domino that had led to this hallway. "I'm not leaving," she said. Something shifted in Minjae's face, fractional, almost imperceptible. But she was learning to read the small language of him, and she caught it. He came on a Friday morning, because abusers understand performance. They understand that witnesses complicate violence, and that, accordingly, the appearance of reasonable concern is its own kind of weapon. Evan Castellano walked into the lobby of Minjae's building in a wool coat, freshly shaved, wearing an expression that had been field-tested across 2 years of convincing other people that Jade was the unstable one. She watched it on the security monitor from upstairs. Ronan's hand on his radio, 2 guards positioned just out of frame. Evan at the reception desk, voice steady and worried, explaining to the concierge that his girlfriend had suffered a mental episode and that he was concerned for her welfare. He said girlfriend with such clean, practiced grief that Jade's hands tightened into fists. Minjae watched beside her, still measuring. He's good at this, she said. Yes. A pause. So am I. He went downstairs alone. She watched through the monitor as Minjae crossed the lobby unhurried, dressed for a Tuesday in a week where nothing extraordinary was happening, and stopped 3 feet from Evan Castellano in the sightline of 2 security cameras and a lobby full of mourning witnesses. She couldn't hear the exchange. She didn't need to. But she saw Minjae angle his body toward the nearest camera on purpose, as if he wanted the building to remember this conversation later. She watched Evan's performance dissolve. It happened in stages. The concerned expression holding, then recalibrating, then something underneath it surfacing that couldn't be classified as anything other than what it was. The recognition of a man who had encountered something he could not intimidate. Evan was accustomed to reading rooms and finding leverage. He was accustomed to being, in any given space, the most dangerous possibility. He was not accustomed to this. Minjae spoke for less than 2 minutes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. The lobby cameras caught every word in crystal resolution for reasons Jade suspected were not accidental. And then she was moving. She didn't decide. Or rather, the decision arrived fully formed, from somewhere below conscious thought, from the part of her that had been rebuilt quietly over 2 weeks of safety and sleep and being treated like a person rather than a problem to be managed. She stepped out of the elevator and walked into the lobby. Evan's eyes found her immediately. She watched the shift, the softening, the practiced sorrow, the beginning of a performance designed to make her doubt herself one final time. She didn't give him the stage. "I'm pressing charges," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised how steady, all of it, on record, in front of witnesses. She looked at him the way you look at something that no longer has power over you. You should leave. The lobby was very quiet. Evan stared at her, and in his expression, beneath the performance, she saw the truth of him, the smallness of a man whose entire identity required a target. He left, not gracefully, but he left. In the elevator, her hands were shaking, not from fear this time, from the specific, unfamiliar tremor of something long suppressed finally being allowed to exist. Minjae stepped in beside her and pressed the button for the top floor. He said nothing. He didn't need to. When she finally exhaled, the sound that came out of her was part breath, part something she hadn't let herself do in 2 years. He stood beside her and let her. Dahlia Park arrived on a Monday with a briefcase, a mind like a closing trap, and zero interest in being anything other than what she was. "I will win this case," she told Jade at the kitchen table, setting out documents with the brisk efficiency of a woman who found sentiment an inefficient use of time. "But you have to understand what winning requires. You will be called a liar. You will be called unstable, manipulative, and financially motivated. Evan's team will imply that Minjae paid you to fabricate an abuse narrative for reasons they'll leave deliberately vague, because implication is more damaging than accusation." Jade sat across from her. "And what do we do about that?" "We build something they can't dismantle." Dahlia's eyes were precise and without softness. "Medical records, digital forensics, witness, testimony. Every bruise you ever explained away, every hospital visit, every text message where he apologized, because abusers always apologize, and in doing so, document themselves." She tapped the table. "And we maintain complete credibility by ensuring nothing about your relationship with Minjae looks like anything other than what it is." "Which is?" Dahlia looked at her. Then, briefly, toward the hallway that led to Minjae's office. "Protection," she said. "It must be only protection. Publicly, clearly, without ambiguity. Because if the jury believes there is something else, something personal, something reciprocal, they will build a story from it that destroys everything. Jade understood. She understood, also, that the warning arrived approximately 3 weeks too late to be entirely useful. Because the distance Dahlia was prescribing, the careful, documented, publicly maintained separation required pretending that 11 nights of shared silence on a balcony hadn't restructured something in her. Required pretending that she didn't catalog the rare occasions Minjae smiled. That she didn't know the difference between his voice when he spoke to Ronan and his voice when he spoke to her. She would maintain the distance. She would be precise and disciplined and do exactly what was required to put Evan behind bars. But she was not naive enough to pretend the discipline was free. Dr. Sato came 3 times a week. She was warm and exact, a combination Jade hadn't known she needed until she had it. Someone who treated her history not as a wound to be pitied, but as evidence to be carefully, compassionately understood. Survival strategies often look like flaws to people who've never needed to survive, Dr. Sato told her in their second session. We're not rewriting who you were, we're building the vocabulary to explain it. The case grew, document by document, testimony by testimony, one careful brick at a time. And in the evenings, Jade sat at the kitchen table and worked. And sometimes, Minjae moved through the same space. And sometimes they spoke, and sometimes they didn't. And she maintained every inch of the distance Dahlia had prescribed. She only broke it once a Thursday evening when the fatigue and the excavation of everything she'd survived became briefly heavier than she could carry. He was across the kitchen when she started crying. He didn't move toward her. He didn't speak. He simply stayed. And later, she realized that remaining present without closing the distance was its own kind of intimacy, the kind that couldn't be argued away in a courtroom because it left no visible mark. Just the quiet certainty that she was not alone. The courtroom was designed to look neutral. It was not neutral. It was a room where the quality of your attorney and the narrative fluency of your adversary determined which version of reality the jury accepted. And Jade had walked into enough rooms that looked one thing and meant another to understand that the architecture of justice, like all architecture, served whoever built it. Evan's team was expensive. She'd expected that. She hadn't expected how cleanly they'd constructed their alternate story, the version where Jade was a woman of calculated instability, who'd fled to the most powerful man she could find and invented a history of abuse to explain her presence there. They were precise, almost admiring in their precision. They painted her as clever, resourceful, capable. It was the most useful strategy available. Take a woman's survival and dress it as scheme. For 3 days, it worked. She watched the jury from the witness stand, and she could read the room the way she'd learned to read Evan's moods, by calibrating the small, honest signals that preceded decisions. 2 of the jurors were drifting, not hostile, just uncertain. The particular uncertainty of people who'd been given 2 equally confident versions of events and hadn't yet found the thing that would resolve the contradiction. Then the prosecution called the final piece, the garage footage. She hadn't watched it since Ronan had shown it to her weeks ago. She watched it now on the courtroom screen, with a full jury and a gallery, and Evan Castellano 8 feet to her left, and she felt not shame, not the self-consciousness she'd braced for, but something clarifying and irreducible. The woman on the screen was not scheming. She was surviving. The jury saw it. She watched the room shift the way rooms shift when a single true thing enters them and reorders everything else. The 2 uncertain jurors weren't uncertain anymore. The woman in the 3rd row, who'd kept her expression carefully judicial, allowed herself once to look directly at Jade with something unambiguous. 3 days later, the forewoman stood, guilty, on all counts. The number that followed 25 years arrived in Jade's chest, not as triumph, but as the specific, quiet collapse of a weight that had been living there so long, she'd begun to assume it was structural. She sat very still while the room moved around her, Dahlia's hand on her arm. Voices. the sound of Evan being escorted away. She didn't look at him. There was nothing there worth the motion of turning her head. She looked at the window instead, high and narrow, admitting a rectangle of flat Chicago winter light, and she breathed. And breathed. And then she stood up. Koslov was still out there. She knew that. The verdict closed one door and left others open in ways that Ronan had briefed her on, with his characteristic refusal to soften facts. But Evan Castellano would spend the next quarter-century in a room he couldn't leave, and Jade Miller had done that. Not Minjae, not Dahlia, not Ronan and his team. Her. She walked out of the courtroom on her own 2 feet, into light that felt, for the first time in years, like it belonged to her. 6 months is long enough to rebuild a life. Not fully, not without seams, but enough to recognize the shape of something that belongs to you rather than to your survival of someone else. Jade's apartment was small, west-facing, and filled with the particular quality of late-afternoon light that made ordinary things look considered. She had a job she'd found herself. A therapist she chose, Dr. Sato, because choice mattered now, and she'd decided to keep the help that actually worked. A routine built around her preferences rather than around the management of someone else's moods. She had, in other words, become difficult to frighten. Not fearless. She had learned to distrust fearlessness. As a posture, it was often just dissociation, wearing confidence's clothes. But she had rebuilt her relationship with fear into something functional. She felt it. She assessed it. She decided. On a Tuesday in early spring, she drove to the parking garage on Wacker, 3rd level, same aisle. She stood beside the space where a sleek black Genesis had once been parked, and she allowed herself the full weight of the memory, the cold, the running, the smell of leather and expensive control, the voice that had asked her one question without cruelty. Then she took out her phone and sent a single message. Same place, same time. I'll be there. He arrived exactly when she expected. She heard the car before she saw it, the quiet engine of a man who had learned not to make unnecessary noise, and then Minjae was there, standing at the entrance of the aisle in a dark coat, watching her with the same still expression she'd been cataloging for 6 long months. He'd waited the entire 6 months. She hadn't asked him to. She hadn't needed to. She understood enough of him now to know that waiting was what he did, not passively, not emptily, but with the full and patient commitment of a man who understood that some things could not be rushed without being broken. She walked toward him. He didn't move. He let her come to him because he understood, as he understood most things, what the gesture required to mean. She stopped 2 feet away, looked at him the way you look at something you've examined from every angle over many sleepless months and have arrived at a conclusion about that you trust. I've thought about this, she said. I know. Not out of gratitude. Not because I don't have anywhere else to be. I know that too. I have an apartment, a job, a therapist, a life that is entirely mine. She held his gaze. And I still want this. Minjae studied her, with those eyes that saw too much and revealed only what he chose, that she had learned over 6 long months of careful attention were not cold, were in fact their own kind of warmth. The kind that doesn't announce itself because it has no interest in performance. His network is still being dismantled, he said, not as a warning, as a fact, offered honestly. Koslov's operation will take another year to neutralize completely. The world I live in does not become simple. I'm not asking for simple. She hadn't flinched. I'm asking for you. The space between them was very quiet. Then Minjae smiled. Small, rare, the kind of smile that wasn't performed for an audience, that hadn't been deployed as strategy, that existed because something had moved through him, and this was the way it showed on his face. Okay, he said. Not good. Not a declaration. Just that one word, quiet and complete, carrying everything that a man like him would never say at volume. He offered his hand. She took it. And Jade Miller, who had once run barefoot through frozen streets, believing she was simply escaping the worst man she would ever meet, understood that she had been wrong about that in the most important possible way. She hadn't been running away. She'd been running toward. And this time, when she stepped forward, she wasn't hiding. She wasn't afraid. She was, finally and completely, choosing.